Hey, let's continue the story of Rumblings in Remardan with Chapter 3, Village. Aneptius went about in his monotonous task of planting until the sun had set. The two boys were tired and irate after being so long under the light reflections from the clouds. Things began to turn darker faster than expected. They went quickly, picking through the vast membranous web of soil that contained the precious food that was the entire source of the family's wealth. There wasn't much to say between the three men. They had a job and they were doing it. No point in complaining or talking about it. They were able to get a sizable number of the mounds built around each individual plant. Groganus was gracious to the Sigurdan family. Over time, they had built up around an acre for use for their meager farming purposes. Of course, other peasants went on a shared system within the village. The vast quantities of land used for farming nearby were split into patches for use by the human serfs there. Families that had more sons to work it were rewarded with more of an arable space by the village council. The dwarven family were set aside and apart from the village. They had managed to get land all to themselves, even if that land was sometimes full of trees and dead things, managed to get their grips on parts of it. Still, it was enough to feed them and keep up with the taxes levied by the Gersog, sometimes running into the problems of famine that plagued their simple existence. Roloff always made sure to plant an extraordinary amount more than he thought would be able to be harvested. Even still, the crop was hit or miss, but potato farming up in this clime was the best thing to do. Even though it had darkened, Aneptius could sense that the day was yet to be over, and so the youngest of the serf dwarves headed off to begin the second part of his day, while Alius and his father continued the mounding process that had been started at day's break. And Aneptius smugly grinned and said, "I'll see y'all tonight after the smithy." Alius looked after him and exclaimed, tired after all the work, "Lucky bastard." Aneptius stopped to turn back, with an even wider grin on his face. "You don't know the half of it." He continued down the forested path that marked the end to their domain of wide soiled land, and the emergence of the wide forest lane. Their many visits had worn out this tract into a much more distinct piece of land than the rest that was there. No undergrowth was to be seen on the wheel-marked ground. Aneptius was used to taking this way into the village. It took a good hour, even at his pace, which at times was a bit meandering. The path itself was often a beautiful walk for him. Those voices in his head seemed to quiet upon seeing that vast nature which seemingly sprawled out in all directions. The sun may have darkened for the moment, but it was at such a brilliant time that all lines of sight were equally open to him. The trickling sound came off to his right where the lazy stream went by, tacitly making its way down to the greater part of the valley where the river lay. "Are you going the right way?" "Yes, follow the stream and we'll get there. Don't you remember?" Aneptius focused on the sounds of the brook and the birds chirping. "They're out in number today. Must be someone's birthday." Aneptius smiled even more at his thought. The air wasn't bad around him. No breeze really to speak of. Just a crisp chill going about. It wasn't enough that it warranted anything heavier than his woolen tunic and long trousers. A good time of year to be out and about. He wasn't expecting to see any travelers on the outskirts where he was coming from. They were located a little higher up in the hills than the rest of the village. No one complained when their cart rolled into town full of all manner of mushrooms and forest goodies. For Aneptius, at this time, things were a bit lonely. He kept his heart where it belonged, though, always daydreaming. There was this one miraculously beautiful girl who he had pictured in his head as his and his alone. She had a strange mixture of golden and brunette hair that flowed long and swept into parts like changing leaves in the autumn when it came, just the last vestiges of life, and they were finally turning brown from tiredness. He could only imagine the sharp square smile from when they would laugh together at a joke he had made, which managed to brighten up her face from its otherwise stern features. At that moment, lines ran down the square sides of her mouth, expertly accentuating those lovely cheeks of hers and pointing out the squat button nose that was much like his own. The eyes of hers could only be matched by the grandiose color of the sky whenever she looked on him in a satisfied, lovely stare. Eneptius wished for a girl like this, in the quiet time between his thoughts and doing work either in the fields or the smithy. It was always this same girl who had haunted his dreams in recent years. He yearned to know her and love her back. But there was absolutely no one in the village or among the household of Ornorian, the Gersog, who matched his quite unique description that was cemented so well in his mind. Eneptius was drawn back into reality by the sudden thundering of hooves that seemed to be coming his way. With the clear day still about, he had no problem seeing a lone rider galloping on his bark-brown mare coming towards him. The rider wore a long, heavy gray woolen cloak that barely held onto his skinny, scrawny body through all of the wind that was generated from this gallop. A light blonde beard bespeckled his high cheekbones when the air finally made it close enough to the walking dwarf. Eneptius was in the midst of doubts that clouded his mind as to the severity of the intentions that this young man could have for him. The dwarf stood there, slightly off to the side, ready to leap into the undergrowth at a second's notice if the need arose. The man was wearing simple trousers, like him, and an equally plain tunic. The only thing that marked him off as not being part of the serfdom was the strange fact that he was riding a horse. The soil from the path flew out from underneath him until the point came where this man decided to abruptly slow into a gallivant in order to approach Eneptius better. This human appeared to be about the same age as the dwarf, who stood there patiently waiting for the initial exchange that was about to occur. Eneptius wasn't too wary. Ornorian had his Reitzars maintain a good sense of security in the area surrounding the village, in case the Revizar of the kingdom ever came to see how well his rule was, and whether or not it needed to be changed. This man didn't look like a bandit. He was too clean for that. And besides, a ruffian wouldn't have slowed down to his prey. "Ho there, friend!" The human tried best to come up with a secure voice, but still he failed when it cracked at the bit of his shout. Eneptius looked up in delight, pleased at the pleasant amusement this little encounter would bring, though he had to keep a stern watch on how much time was wasted. Eneptius needed to reach the smithy soon to even be eligible for his apprenticeship, which his father had negotiated out. But still, it seemed that this might take his mind off of already aching feet from the long day. "Ho!" Eneptius responded, after a moment of thought in common parlance. The rider stopped his horse to reveal a curled blade on the rear. He smiled back to Eneptius's now idiotic grin, which by that point had disappeared. "So it's going to be that, then," Eneptius thought. Then the dwarf bounded off into the forest on his right. He splashed through the once sweetly babbling brook, which now just felt as an impediment to his escape. Water went up all around him as he exited the stream and entered into the heady undergrowth of plants that tried to strangle at each other for the sunlight. It was these same weeds that proved to be his downfall. Quite literally. The young dwarf tripped after his third short bound into the thickness that was perpetuated there. Eneptius went down in a most unseemly fashion. He closed his eyes to the invasive plants and was able to barely catch himself on his palms but his arms gave out under his own weight, and the dwarf landed straight down on his stomach with a loud grunt, being let out in the process. Eneptius turned onto his back as the surrounding vegetation was crunched down by the weight of the horse which now approached him. Eneptius was flustered and breathing heavy when the rider came up to greet him again. "Easy there, pal," the human almost spat out as a command. "I'm not here to rob you. Just the opposite." The rider stepped down from his horse in one quick movement, surprisingly agile for his lanky size. Eneptius now saw that the curved blade was only a scythe, a sickle, really, which must have just been brought out in such an event as a robbery, if it were to take place. Eneptius then took his time to get up, rolling back onto his back to push himself up to a short standing position. The rider then helped him up in this last bit of struggle. Eneptius wasn't the most athletic of the dwarven races. Eating so many potatoes over time did have its impact on him. "Well, I hope you keep up your stamina for where you're going to report to," the human chuckled a bit, seeing Eneptius struggle on, being helped up by this stringy man. The dwarf wiped off as much dirt and grass that he could manage, which, after all was said and done, wasn't much. "It's these damned roots. I would have been long gone if I hadn't tripped, you know. You're lucky I did." The human had to contain his laughter at this point. Eneptius let out a long grrr, and upon seeing the way that this dwarf was feeling, the rider now tried to make up for it. "You know, I didn't mean to scare you off like that. Can't be too careful in a forest like this." He looked around to see the vast quantity of trees that threatened to engulf all their senses. Eneptius cut short his rather strange break from their conversation. "You know, just tell me, who are you?" "I'm a messenger, so don't be afraid. The second sublime, Prince Cassius, sent me to find any dwarves who were out this way. We heard noise that there were some of you, but we didn't expect anyone so far out from the village." Eneptius rolled his eyes and shrugged his broad shoulders. "You know, no one ever does. What does his most worthiness require of us at this time?" The rider was surprised at this good fortune. "Well, I'm glad to have found you then. We don't have many who are so excited at the mention of his most worthiness. Prince Cassius requires all dwarves to gather in the village, so you're headed the right way at least. You know, are there any more of you out here?" "No, I'm the only one who lives out here." The young dwarf lied, hoping he was successful. The rider gave an inquisitive look after Eneptius. He wasn't buying it. That's when Eneptius responded again. "That's why I ran. I hoped you wouldn't ransack me in my house. Where's the first eminent Prince Kulavab, anyways? Why is the second prince here?" The human wasn't quite expecting this question. He almost reeled back in shock. "His Highness? He wouldn't deign to lead the troops, of course. He's too busy dealing with all the politics in the Nestrital. Not all of the high and mighty enjoy life under his leadership, you know." The rider looked about himself, making sure that in the thick of the woods no one would be able to overhear them. He still lowered his voice even, and made strong eye contact upon uttering his next sentence. "Between you and me, I don't much care for it either," after he refused to champion Groganus. Eneptius was taken aback by this statement. "Surely you can't be serious. The first eminent prince not being a grogman? Where did you hear this? It can't possibly be true." The rider shook his head in sad acknowledgement. People in the army talk. The second sublime prince is about as strong a grogman as they come, and he makes it a well-known secret that there is no love lost between him and his brother. Eneptius thought for a long time on this and said, besides in the Nestrital, how have the rest of the Dvarnin in the provinces taken it? Now that I can't tell you. They aren't too keen on talking to us about it, though the local Reitzars have a mouth on them when they start to drink. Most of the Gerzogs keep to themselves, but their masters in the Nestrital make their voices heard to the public. Do you know what an Ornorian thinks on this? Oh, he's like his eminence now, an Umniki. Eneptius released a quick puff of air from between his bearded lips. I never did pay much attention to politics between the Dvarnin, but that makes sense. It always seemed so far above a simple dwarf to care. Though Ornorian never liked the traditional ways of treating serfs with respect and the common love for Groganus. The writer shook his head again. No good will come from denying Groganus his say in the kingdom. He quickly made the sign of the cross across his lengthy chest. No good indeed. I can't imagine what Kolovob is thinking. Eneptius placed his hand on his chin, thinking again about this news. Then he raised his eyes high towards the human standing there, likewise pensive. He struck out a hand and said, "Hey, I'm Eneptius." "Eneptius, huh? Very glad to meet you. I'm Ertis." Ertis almost had to stoop down to firmly take Eneptius's hand, but they met mid-range near his chest. "So, Eneptius, there's no one else out that way you came?" Eneptius became startled again at the prospects of sending his family off to whatever was brewing in the village, in the army. "Shoot, I almost forgot. My family lives over there on a farm, about 30 minutes walk down that path." "Oh, sorry, I thought you meant other dwarven families, not just my own." Ertis's face turned stern for a second, but immediately softened into a kindly smile. "Don't worry about it, Eneptius. I'll head out that way and let them know to come into Trotnaya." They both walked back to the road together, this time trying not to be splashed in the waters there. "And to imagine, you thought I'd kill you." The two new friends shared a hearty laugh together. They shook hands and said, "Safety on the roads. Groganus guides." And they parted ways. Ertis headed off down the route that Eneptius had just come from, back towards the farmstead out there. He cantered off at a brisk pace in order to make good time so he could get back to carousing back in the village. Eneptius continued on his own way, getting closer and closer to his final destination. He had to let Armador know that smithing wouldn't be possible today. Grr. The old man won't be happy about this. He let his mind slip, however, from those thoughts into the happy sounds posed by the creek nearby. The sun was still high up, nearing its zenith, so there was still plenty of time to get there. The sun was slightly hidden behind the vast amounts of cloud that tried to smother the yellow rays which tried to escape. And one or two was able to, at least. The forest still continued on for a good time, until it gave way to the broad, undulating farmlands, which grew all manner of a variety of crops. It was a very nice sight that appeared to Eneptius then. Human serfs worked hard in the fields, clearing the snow off of their acres to start the hard process of plowing the now softening soil. Children ran about near the edges of the forest, whacking each other with sticks, pretending to be soldiers and Reitzars fighting each other. Some fled at the sight of this young dwarf, who had just exited the path that led him there. Women were pounding out the animal skin rugs, getting all of the dust and mites out from it. The young women were tossing out any sort of waste that they could find inside their huts, and Neptius stopped to take a look around at all that was out there in this world. The boys who were old enough were out in the fields working just like he had been that morning. And Neptius made his way through the outermost farms in to see the village now, teeming with life. He saw the recruiting Reitzars in the village swaggering about, their armor shining in a stunning brilliance that only the fighting dwarves could make beautiful with their grotesque bestial helmets and shields to look quite tantalizing in the sun's rays. He grew scared at first from their visage, but then looked on, admiring the handiwork that must have gone into making such instruments. This must have been what Ertis was trying to get everyone to come to witness, and it really was quite something. The dwarven guards to the Dvarnin were all dressed in such a manner that it almost outshined the entire company that they were serving in. Even the Reitzars were put to shame by their grandiose appearance. These dwarves were the famed Chudov company. And Neptius had heard tales of their exploits from his father. Wherever and whenever something eventful went down, they were there guarding the Dvarnin and following their commands to the letter. So the second Sublime is actually here. Oi, I need to go talk to Armador fast and get back here, and Neptius thought quickly. Then he looked further down the main street to see rows upon rows of military tents, all surrounded by rather astute earthen mounds, to keep out any unwanted combatants. The lesser ranks wore the strong green and brown tunics of Remardan, in a checkered pattern with the Groganus axe emblazoned on their red upon that field, making for quite the sight. Banners waved about, and flags flew high with the same paraphernalia. The lower orders in the army bandied about simple pikes to fight off the enemies from afar, and clubs to finish off any who got in closer. And Neptius could not help but to feel the pride which flowed through his deep dwarven roots whenever he spied those flowering banners and flags which belonged to this great nation of dwarves. The metal scales of the Reitzar's armor shined and sparkled as they strode along the streets looking for any optimistic young lad to join up into the ranks. These fighters looked doubly impressive once they mounted upon their zaik, these strange scarab-like creatures with deep amber shells and the most horrifying pincers that protruded from their faces. These might have been tamed by the warriors of the northern kingdom, but they had by no means been tamed throughout the world. Still, in the wilds and the forests of the land there were these zaik which were not tamed, and they strived daily for supremacy against the various fighting tribes of boars and goblins who scrabbled all over the forests. Amongst this fighting group, there were even several of the wild race of orcs from the roaming lands down in the southern steppes, big, burly creatures who were sporting sturdy leather armor, and either carrying huge Zweihanders, which were almost as long as their own muscular bodies, or simply dual-wielding the rune-covered axes of the dwarves. And Neptius had only heard stories of the often ruinous exploits of these harsh orcs who followed the flow of money that came out of the northern dwarven kingdom. These creatures were terrifying in comparison to their human fellows, and especially strange-looking when standing with their dwarven men-at-arms. The orcs were huge, standing on average the size of a very tall human, about 6'8" at least. The earth seemed to tremble where they walked about in great leather boots, the size of Neptius's arm. I never imagined that Dad was telling the truth, he thought in amazement as a group of them wandered past. Something big must be going on. I have to hurry up and see Armador. Then, lute sounds flowed out from the local tavern where Neptius could see the leather jerkins of humans being undone outside on the porch in anticipation of the excitement about to commence. People in all shapes and sizes piled around the various booths and wooden bench tables that were set up there. Buxom-breasted human women ran about, carrying beers filled to the brim, with the foaming suds overflowing at points whenever they got pinched on the behind by the soldiers who were spending their off-duty times there. A sweet male bravado carried out from the open door where the troops were singing their usual shanties. Oh, will you know a lassie who'll go together? She'll be growing potatoes together, or the crops that need to be cleaned by your mops, for all the spilled cabbage, and ravage the lands that have been split by our hands. A hearty laugh followed the ending of their already finished song, and a clink from smacking their clay tankards right back down onto the tables. Ineptius again felt a pang of jealousy go through his brain, quite like a sudden jolt, and he autonomously shivered from all the way from his neck down his back in one swift movement. When are you going to get some friends, Ineptius? That annoying voice popped up in his head again, with the sounds about it as if it had many, many friends. I have plenty of friends, his normal voice seemed to interject vehemently. Marcellus, Sammius, Matthias, Hobbles, and Brentus. I don't need any more. They've always had my back and always will. Besides, it's not like I'm missing out. What do others do? Get drunk and have some meaningless sex? At least these few will always be with me. Turning back to the sneaking voice that always tried to get at him. But where is Brentus? You haven't heard from him in ages. He shook his head again vehemently against the pressing thoughts that always seemed to overwhelm him. Ineptius couldn't help but feel a bit horny at the sight of these women with their bosoms almost bouncing out of their tight woven clothes. The annoyance struck back at him again. When are you going to find someone for you? You think that dream girl will ever come and love a dwarf like you? Ineptius shook his head to try and remove these pestering thoughts that encroached on his very soul. The last time he even mentioned bringing a girl home to the farm, his mother peppered him with questions. How tall is she? What's her hair look like? Is she from a good family? Nice pretty face? And of course, the most important question of them all. Is she a dwarf? Ineptius responded in kind, denying everything and regretting that he had even mentioned this. His brother Alius knew better than him by now, and just stopped mentioning whenever he met someone. It was both a hassle and considered bad luck by Alius to say anything before anything had actually happened. The early stages were always the trickiest with women, and when you add an extra woman who wants to know everything about the new one, it only becomes a great pain and extra annoyance. Unlike Alius, Ineptius never seemed to remember his mistakes, and always brought women back home to view the fields together and get a little more comfortable when the harvest time came about. Ineptius felt that pang again, seeing all these soldiers enjoying themselves out here in the crisp, early spring air. The smoke roared out from the chimney trying to heat the whole of the establishment, but constantly failing since everyone decided to keep rushing in and out. He could see several men around each other, throwing dice into a hard-scrap patch of ground, trying to determine the fate of the intricate armies that they had drawn into the sand. Some more people were taking turns, ganging up on their comrade in a game of cards, where they were trying to force the circle to turn so the besieged man could then gang up on the next player. Overall, it seemed to Ineptius that there was an air of joy and anticipation in the whole village just judging from this one scene. One thing that resonated throughout it all was that there were no dwarves in that crowd which was having its merriment. Strange. Must all be at the castle enjoying whatever Honorian planned for the number 2 prince. Ineptius again moved away from this and had a grand smile on his face from all the music and joy that was protruding out from the tavern. He went past some lopsided houses with square-set wooden walls and shingled roofs that had been set in what must have been ages ago. They were starting to fall about in some places, with splinters hanging about here and there for the unwary traveler to mar their bones on. Aneptius picked up his pace in accordance to the ever-weakening sound of the fife and fiddle that he was leaving behind. The words reached him even at this distance. "I'll go and join the bloody strife till this cruel war is over. If I'm stabbed on the field and I die, then who will protect my wife and child and care for me old mother?" The men must really be drunk if they're singing for another war, Aneptius thought. He couldn't help but have the sinking feeling of missing out as he proceeded to the exact opposite end of the village to go find his master for the blacksmithing he was tasked with doing. The wide wooden pen and roof spread out in front as Aneptius got closer to the smithy. There was no smoke that spread out from its large forge. Only many logs could be seen spread out in a simply built cabin on it, around the single sparkling ember, which could be brought to life in an instant with a little help from the bellows. Armador was out there, sitting with the wind in his curling white hair. The human's brown eyes could be seen scanning the horizon, looking for his new apprentice to come to work. "Aye, there you are. I thought you might not show up. Know how lazy dwarves are. But here you are. Let's get started right away. Here, put this on." Armador handed Aneptius a leather apron and right after shoved a hammer into his face. Before the dwarf could say anything about what was going on in the not-so-distant village, the old man had him standing there in the brisk wind, learning how to make nails from lumps of iron. The bellows blew up and the fire raged into varying torrents as Armador went about, showing Aneptius just the right way to use the instruments. The old man gave out handy examples of how to knock on these immovable pieces, which started to take shape with the heat, with the throws of his gnarled hand. Couple of whacks here, couple whacks there, some at a discreet angle, which Aneptius soon got a hang of, and some straight down to land with a loud clang noise as the metal was being lengthened against the flat of the anvil. Sparks constantly flew off the pieces of metal as they were violently bent into shape. Luckily, his beard never caught fire from it. If only Dad could see me now, Aneptius thought, in his sublime ruminations upon the task he was now performing. There needed to be nails made, and he was the one being trained to do it. Armador was quietly standing back, looking over the shoulder of his new dwarven apprentice. It was a high risk taking on this dwarf because of the stock he was bred from. And besides, what human willingly wants to work with a dwarf? After all that was done to the native population in what was now part of Remardan, none could hardly blame this logic and thinking. Armador made this leap in trust on a wise whim that he once had. The old man figured that with almost bent spine and crooked figure, there wasn't much time to find a successor for the village's blacksmith. Dwarves were known for being good at these types of crafts. Plus, Roloff had offered him up with no want of pay for the lad. The stingy man couldn't refuse such an offer. Even the other people in the village wanted to house their son with him and get food from the position, but not this dwarf. Food was hard to come by in these days. People knew that whatever they had was all they were going to get, and the food tab often piled up with no foreseeable end in sight. That was thanks to what had happened in the war, and the unfortunate occurrences that came about as a result. Thinking back on it, Aneptius had once asked, "Dad, what happened during the war?" "Nothing good, son." And that was about how most conversations evolved around the topic. Soon, the children stopped asking. Armador had just started training this boy to be good at blacksmithing. It wasn't going very well. Eneptius tried for a long time to get just the right techniques down, but the boy lacked patience. It had to be learned from many calloused and burnt joints that the best thing to do was wait. Still, he often got those even when trying to make things as simple as nails. Eneptius wasn't one much for the waiting game. He saw how easy Armador had done it, even in the shape he was in, and wanted to finish them immediately like that. But this time, he had got it. Clearly shaped and tanged nails were formed as an extension of his hand went down each time to hit the only glowing red objects. If they were any hotter, he'd be screwed and lose the shape entirely. But this time, he got it. The boy beamed with his brilliant smile that was almost always on his face. Groganus wanted the best for us, and that's what would happen, whatever Groganus had in fate for his dwarven followers. The human followers of the deity were a different matter entirely, however. Eneptius once again made the sign of a single-edged axe on his chest, in thanks for being able to finally make this thing that was so important to the village. Nails were literally the building blocks of everything there, and it was only one step closer to making him into an actual blacksmith. Armador clapped and chirped noisily to get over the sounds of the bellows working in. "You did it! Now just keep on doing it. Hobbles needs lots more where that came from." "You got it, sir. Easy now. Just have to follow these steps again." Eneptius mumbled this last part to himself. The young dwarf did truly seem to have this penchant for blacksmithing about him. Even after not having the patience to fully learn how to do the thing, he still managed to make a sizable amount of nails for the cobbler in town. And it was a good thing, too. Eneptius didn't have many friends in Otradnae, and Hobbles was one of the best he had. There would always be a special place in his heart for Hobbles. After a tiring and solid hard work of a couple of hours, Eneptius had made quite a lot of nails. "Wow, you're much better than the others. Eneptius, start to rival me when I was just an apprentice like yourself," the old man said to him. The dwarf let out a strong puff of air towards the flames that faced him. "How many do we need?" Armador hadn't thought this through fully at the time of his question. "Well, that looks good for now. Maybe we'll get more orders some other day, but that's plenty enough for our cobbler." They let the fires die down, and the nails were swiped up from the bucket of oil that lay nearby cooling them. The two workers set about creating an elaborate system of keeping the coals just right, so they would still have a bit of a spark in them when they needed it. Armador then fetched a boiling pot of tea out from his stove to bring a teapot full of their favorite buckthorn flavor out to drink and watch the rain drizzle by beyond the shelter of the smithy overhang. Luckily, the Wrightsars kept a good watch out over the town these days, and the equipment was simply left out with a small door to guard an otherwise open-air smithy. The old human and young dwarf took a seat at his roughly hewn table that sat out there, day in and day out. The tea was piping hot to go along with this cold spell that had taken over to mark the end of winter. Still, it was the perfect weather to be out there doing the rudimentary work on the small iron nails. The temperature outside balanced well with the heat of the forge. The tea was a good thing for them to ingest and raise their spirits after they had diminished the flames from the forge. It was getting quite late in the afternoon now, Atronai had quieted down a bit, and the sleepy village was about done for the day. The two smiths relaxed, looking out at what would start to become pouring rain. And really, the town needed it. There had been a rather long dry spell, and this wet would soon turn the dry dirt into a wet, sludgy mud that would inevitably suck up the hard workers' boots from their feet. Ineptius tried not to hunch over in his chair, though it was hard after pounding so long at those metal pieces. It was a stark contrast when he was able to have a straight back. The old man was sitting there, uncaring of his already ruined back. They sat, with their thoughts in their heads. The dwarf tried to stay occupied by slowly drinking his tea and watching the puddles gather up underneath his withering gaze. Finally, he gave up trying and hunched with both arms on the table in front of him for support. "Thanks for letting me do this," Ineptius made piercing eye contact with Armador and exhaled a weary sigh as he stated that. The human joined him in his sighs and quickly broke that eye contact. What can I say? You're working for free and I'm too old to do this stuff anymore. I needed someone. Ineptius grew up a serf and therefore fully felt that he had a serf's soul. At least, that's how he acted sometimes. The bluntness was welcome and uncommon amongst most nobles, and humans even. "When did you stop doing it yourself?" the dwarf asked, hoping to weasel in a bit further to the good graces of his master. "It was a good while back." "Oh, what changed? What happened?" Ineptius interjected quickly to keep this demure man talking. Armador took a long draught of his tea and sat there for a moment, pondering whether or not to even answer this young one. "A piece of hot iron shot from one of my cuts all the way from the anvil to the top of my head, and next thing I knew, it was going down my back, and it messed the whole damn thing up." Ineptius cringed just at the thought of it. "Ouch! That must have hurt. How'd you even recover from that?" Again, they sat there quietly, simply listening to the rain pitter-patter down in a steady stream now. The old man deigned to respond again. "Well, a Reitzar noticed the forge was still lit during the night and came to make sure nothing was amiss. He found me." He gestured over towards the forge area, lying there. He threw water on the flames and started to smack me a bit with his iron gauntlet. Armador turned to the side to show off the now pronounced scars in his cheek. Ineptius hadn't noticed them before. It was a grisly sight to look at, but over time it had healed so that it wasn't that noticeable. Armador continued his tale. "At least he woke me up, and that kept the place from burning down." He had noticed Ineptius's pained look and tried his best to assuage him of his worries. "Reitzars aren't all that bad, you know. What else would he have been able to do to wake me up? Pfft. Anyway, that's what happened to me, and to my back." "Still, he could have thrown water on you or something, at least taken off his gauntlet to wake you up." Ineptius posited quietly in defense of the old man. Armador looked sideways at him. How was he supposed to know that I wouldn't just get up and start attacking him, huh? There were once times when the dead rose only to try reclaiming what little life they could. "No, he did the right thing and sent Herbition to me." Ineptius didn't argue anymore, but he knew better than to ask more questions of his new master. There was a sullenness that filled the air then, as the rain started to churn away that dirt into mud, it would now become. Before I start filling your head of those old days, you'd best be getting home before it starts to hail and gets too dark. You're not so bad at this. I'll see you tomorrow, Neptius. Well, thank you. Have a good night, Armador. And Neptius swigged up the rest of his tea. It was a strange mix of chamomile and dandelion, but neither of these grew in the area. He got up and shrugged the tunic harder around his tired body. The rain kept coming down, and it was getting darker. He had to get home before the curfew began, and he'd have to face his parents. And Neptius was too tired to deal with that. He just wanted to eat and fall fast asleep, but that probably wouldn't happen. Something always went wrong for him. Either the dwarf was very lucky or very unlucky. In this case, it was very unlucky. The rain had turned into a torrent of water that continued to shoot down from the heavens in droves. He was outside of any friendly territory, when suddenly he realized that Hobbles lived right over there in that short, squat hut, with hardly any roofing still on it, but just barely enough to keep the man dry. Neptius walked towards the door in grim determination at the oncoming rain and wind. It was dark all around, especially inside of the house. Neptius started to pound on the door as hard as he could muster the strength for, to get past the sounds of the wild nature that was disrupting his strides to get back for the night. For some reason, he felt there was an overwhelming sense of urgency to get into the beaten-up old hut of his friend. Neptius slammed his fist down onto the wooden slab of the door, trying to get a result from the inert hut. So far, there was nothing but the ongoing churn of rain to be heard. "Where are you, Hobbles?" Neptius tried his best to get his voice out through the downpour. He pressed his ear against the door, hoping to glean any information when there was a crash from inside. A rather high-pitched male voice erupted from there. What do you want?" The A's were drawn out far along their various sound waves. "Oh, come on, open the door, Hobbles. Depends on who's there. You might not be no friend of mine, and so I might not want to let you in. Come on, it's Neptius. It's terrible out here. Let me in." "Well," here he stopped to think a bit. "How do I know it's actually you?" "Come on, we've known each other for 5 years at least. You know my voice, Hobbles." The rain kept battering down onto the poor dwarf outside, and Neptius was growing tired of this. He was drenched from head to toe and getting wetter by the second. "That's it, Hobbles. If you don't open up, then I'm leaving." The rain drummed on a now silent hut. Then, suddenly, there was a boom! The sound of thunder, a flash of lightning, and a crash from inside. And Neptius barged in through the flimsy wooden piece that counted as a door. It fell apart with little effort, and he was inside the now darkened hut. And Neptius strained his ears, trying to find the location of the sound that had just occurred. The air in the room was still reverberated the mites of dust that were now swirling about in the intermittent flashes of lightning. Shoes were piled up in random pell-mell stacks all over the entire place from what Neptius could make out. There was a distinct smell of something oily, somewhat like the shoe shine that Hobbles had used for ages in making his wares better, but it was off for some reason. There was much more of an acrid cotton stench to whatever this strange draft was bringing in. And Neptius couldn't make out much more from the grayness that pervaded the entire scene. A passing torchlight changed all that. He didn't know where it came from, or what had projected it. There was suddenly the bright crack of light, and he was able to successfully cut through the now overwhelming darkness of the hut. Eneptius didn't complain or question this new source of knowledge that, beyond a cursory glance around himself, there was no clear starting point for the light, so he graciously accepted the help and thanked Groganus silently. Eneptius clearly saw where his human friend was lying on the ground now. A gash concealed behind his short-cropped hair could be seen leaking out what was most likely blood. Eneptius jumped over to the workbench and grabbed what appeared to be the cleanest rag there, though most were spotted with various dark substances. He ran back and placed it on Hobble's head, where the gash was to quell the flow of blood. The cobbler appeared rather normal. His slightly slanted almond eyes and dark skin betrayed his ancestry as one of the few who had been originally from the waste to the west. Hobbles wasn't very tall for a human, only about a foot or so higher than Eneptius. A broken clay cup lay cracked to the side that smelled thickly like honeyed beer. He must have just tripped around here at the shock of the thunder and the dark, Eneptius mused to himself while holding his friend's bandaged head in his hands. It wasn't dark there now, however. That's when he heard a rather serpentine sound erupt from the opposite end of the room. Something large was moving around back there and hiding behind some of the larger boxes that contained the leather used to craft shoes. A rather large creature emerged from behind that portion of the hut to fully show itself to the hapless dwarf who was cradled behind his friend. It stood on two legs that bragged of feet, which each sprouted 10 different shaped fingers that it used to move around. Looking upwards on its body, Eneptius could see that the legs were shaped entirely human-like, and its torso was in the grips of a fight with itself. It was as if two hands were struggling to gain the upper struggle on the other in a combat for supremacy. They were interlocked fists that were trying to tug apart each other. Its arms were probably the most normal of all, just a set of two very dwarf-like appendages that were covered in hair and surprisingly short for its rather long body. The neck was like a man's again, but the face appeared in the most frightening form of all. It was in a broad, concave shape, with two great eyes staring out, one flat nose, holes instead of ears, and one grand maw that consisted of a ring of teeth which encompassed what looked like a long purple tongue. The eyes moved separately of one another to simultaneously scan the room. Both eventually came to find a final rest on the dwarf crouched in the middle of it. The blaze of light that Eneptius was seeing had no impact on the huge saucer-like eyes. Our young hero's breath stopped in his throat. His limbs ached all over. There felt a sudden rush out from his farthest parts as if they had fallen asleep. Eneptius could hardly clench his fist in anger at what was happening to him. There was an utter sense of dread emanating all around himself. The thoughts that normally bounced around in there decided to turn off at this moment. The creature then met Eneptius' eyes in solidarity. A voice went out from it as the teeth seemed to move on their own in a circle around its inner mouth. "Don't worry, it will all be over soon." The sound that had withdrawn from what seemed to resemble a very deep bass woman's voice. The fingers started to move independently of the legs and propelled this creature onwards in its route towards this dwarf, squatting there on his friend. It didn't move fast, nor slowly either, but as if it were cutting its way through the jelly in the humid midnight air. The creature kept its two eyes firmly grasped upon Eneptius's blue ones. They had a remarkable red shimmer about them that dispelled any sense of urgency. Eneptius was so drawn into these two great big swirling orbs that his sense of time seemed to stand still for minutes on end. He then let out a pleased groan. "Oh, Groganus." The creature broke off its contact as it hunched back as if hit by something malicious. Suddenly, context returned to Eneptius as he quickly drew the sign of the X about himself. There was a furious quivering now about the monster that had just interrupted his night. The rain still hammered on the roof, but the thing now jumped through the open hole up there, and its fear to escape from the rather ordained signs. It fell onto the other side of the hut in a loud crunch. The sounds of furious chattering marked its exit from the sleepy village. Throughout that time, the strange torchlight was nowhere to be seen. And that concludes Chapter 3, The Village, in my book, Rumblings in Remardan. I hope you enjoyed it. And please like, subscribe, share it to your friends. And check out my books on Amazon. I have 2 out now, Rumblings in Remardan and Deviations of Defiance. Thank you.